All right, thank you very much for joining us again. My name is Nicole Phelps. I'm an associate professor of history at the University of Vermont. I'm very delighted to be here and to be chairing this session on the world reconfigured. We have three very prestigious historians with us today, and I'll be introducing each one before they give their remarks. And our goal is to have each presenter speak for between 10 and 15 minutes, hopefully not more than 15, and then we'll move to questions. So our first panelist is Professor Erez Manela of Harvard University. Of course, has a very important book on the Wilsonian moment, self-determination, and the international origins of anti-colonial nationalism, as well as a recent edited volume on empires at war, dealing with kind of, I'm going to call it the greater World War I era, and also a book on the eradication of smallpox. Thank you.
Should I go up to?
Whatever makes you more comfortable.
Yeah, I'll go up. It's a pretty big room, and I want to project.
I want to go up myself.
Well, thanks very much for that kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me here. I want to make a couple of notes just before launching into my remarks. The essay that we're contributing for the volume on which my remarks will be based is a co-authored essay that I've written with Robert Gervath of University College Dublin. He's an eminent scholar of the First World War, and editor of a book series with Oxford University Press called The Greater War, which is designed to reframe and reconsider the history of the First World War along numerous different aspects and in numerous different parts of the world, not just in Europe. As part of that series, Robert and I have, as Nicole mentioned, co-edited a book called Empires at War, 1911 to 1923. This book is not quite out yet, but it's completely finished. We have more than a dozen really terrific essays on the different empires that fought in World War I. One of the contributors to the volume, Chris Capozzola, writing on the American Empire in World War I, is here. And the book is, as I said, everything is finished. We just selected we just finalized the cover, and should be out in June or July from Oxford University Press. So much of what I will say, or everything really that I will say today in my presentation, is based on our Robert and I on our joint work on this volume. So why, first of all, do we even need a book series of that description and a book that I just described, Empires at War? Is it really something new to say about the history of the First World War? Obviously, we have literally miles of shelves space in our libraries filled with books on the war. It's not exactly a neglected subject, one of the most written about historical events of all time. However, the basic premise of what Robert and I have been doing, is that one of the most profitable ways to say something new about the First World War is to reframe and refocus it along thematic, temporal, and spatial axes. So the irony of it that although our book is timed to come out to coincide with the Centennial of 1914, one of the central arguments of the book, the central premises even, is that 1914 doesn't matter as much as we thought it did, which is why the book is called Empires at War, 1911 to 1923. So 1918 and 1919 are essentially dethroned by this reframing. There's basically two assumptions about the history of the war that much, not all, but much of the existing literature is premised upon, and we're trying to question with this volume. Our first premise with the volume is that it pays to examine the war within a frame that is both longer temporally and wider spatially than is usual. We argue that the convulsion of 1914 to 1918 was in fact the epicenter of a cycle of armed conflict that began in 1911 with the now nearly forgotten Italian attack on territories in North Africa and the Mediterranean previously controlled by the Ottoman Empire, mostly what is today in Libya, and then by the Balkan War starting in 1912. And that the massive waves of violence triggered by the imperial collapses and the imperial ambitions unleashed by the war continued at least until 1923, when the Treaty of Lausanne defined the territory of the new Turkish Republic, and the same year, the end of the Irish Civil War, the restoration of a measure of equilibrium in Germany after the end of the Franco-Belgian occupation of the Ruhr, and the stabilization of the Bolshevik regime in Russia after an extremely bloody civil war there. And indeed, the previous year, 1922, the reconfiguration of power relations in the Pacific at the Washington Conference. So we see all of these events happening in the space of time between 1919 and 1923 as, in a sense, continuous with a transformation that is wrought in international society during this period of time. Our second contention, so first contention, broader spatial and temporal frames. Our second contention, which is of course related to the first one, is that we should see the war not so much as a war between European nation states, which was the premise of much of the propaganda of European nation states at the time, the wartime propaganda, and has remained to a large extent the premise of much of the literature, historical literature that emerged after the war. But we should see it primarily as a war of empires, fought by empires and aimed at imperial defense, imperial consolidation, and imperial expansion. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to rethink the history of the Great War, first, as one of imperial conflict, and I should say global imperial conflict, and second, relatedly, within a longer temporal and wider spatial frame that has been typical. Now, this sort of framing has been gaining in popularity in recent years, and we've had some books called The Global History, World War I, The Global History, although I have to say that most of them, I think, are not really global histories. They say they're global histories, but they're really European with a few things attached at the margin. There's certainly been focus for a long time on the global aspects of certainly the British and French empires as part of World War I. Though in our volume, our authors went deeper and farther in the previous treatment. So, for example, we have a chapter in the volume on the Portuguese Empire in the First World War, and all sorts of fascinating material on the conflict and military clashes in Portuguese or in and around Portuguese territories in East and West Africa, which are an integral part of the strategy of the war. We have a chapter on the Italian Empire. The Italians often get kind of shunted aside. But in a sense, we sort of argue that they started the whole thing, by their projects of their project of imperial expansion into North Africa. The Japanese Empire, of course, already mentioned, is a crucial component, and in general, the East Asian arena, the East Asian theater, is a crucial component of the war. Of course, it doesn't see nearly as many casualties in terms of casualty numbers as the European theaters, but it is crucial in the calculations, strategic calculations of the various powers, and the reconfiguration of the order in the Far East is perhaps one of the most significant legacies of the First World War, if you're talking about legacies. And of course, then there's the United States, which is, of course, often mentioned as part of the story, but not often mentioned as an empire. We, of course, all know that the United States has a colonial empire before, during, and after the First World War. And we can imagine that the war has an impact on the colonial empire, and the colonial empire has an impact on the American conduct in the war, although I would challenge you to find anywhere to read about that outside of Chris's chapter in our forthcoming book. So that's been one of the funnest part of being involved in this, is trying to rethink not just the United States. The United States is an empire. That's almost become a hackneyed phrase, but specifically the imperial aspects of U.S. participation in the First World War. And then there's also one also has to think about China, which is a kind of an interesting place relative to our imperial framework, because it's an erstwhile empire that had just recently, when the war comes about, it just recently transitioned into a republic, but really still retains, and to this day really, still retains many of the accoutrements of empire, not least it's the territorial extent and the diversity of populations and systems of control of populations, which are inherited from the imperial predecessors, of course, do not simply disappear in 1911 when the empire changes form and becomes a republic. So what do we think that we see more clearly when we think about the Great War as a global war of empires rather than as one of European nation states? Well, first, it focuses our attention on how the various contenders mobilized, deployed, and demobilized different imperial populations, including, by the way, here, settler imperial populations, particularly in the British dominions, imperial populations in differential ways, and why this mattered both to the general history of the war and to the mobilized groups themselves and to the legacy of the war in those various places. I'm just talking with someone before this began about the centrality of the war in the shaping of, I suppose you could call it national/imperial identities in the white dominions of the British Empire, particularly in Australia and New Zealand, but also I think in Canada. After all, if we take the conflict seriously as a world war, we must craft and have been crafting a history that does full justice to the millions of imperial subjects called upon to defend their government's interests, to the theaters of war that lay far beyond Europe, including in Asia and Africa, and to the wartime roles and experiences, also post-war roles and experiences of extra-European peoples. The mobilization of millions of imperial subjects on both sides of the conflict was essential for combatant states, from Germany to the Ottoman, Habsburg, and Romanov empires, of course, and also to the Entente powers, and also non-combatant laborers from China, most notably, were vital to the conflict. There's a terrific recent book by Su Guoqi at the University of Hong Kong about Chinese laborers, really path-breaking in the First World War, and Guoqi is also, in our volume, the contributor of the China chapter. He has a previous book on China in World War I. The book about laborers is especially fascinating because of the breadth of the research and really bringing to light in exquisite detail an episode that we sort of all knew about. Everybody who studies World War I knows that there were Chinese laborers, but really knew almost nothing in detail about prior to his unearthing of all these documents. Of course, already mentioned here, fighting took place in many places outside of Europe, in Siberia, in China, in the Middle East, in the South Pacific, in East Africa, West Africa, so forth. And had not only major impacts in all of these different places, but also reverberated back to the metropoles and the central arenas of fighting. The impact of the war was profoundly felt by hundreds of millions living across the imperial world, bringing conscription, occupation, inflation, and economic dislocation, while also kindling new opportunities, ideas, plans, and hopes. The global imperial frame also makes it easier to see that the mass violence did not end with the armistice of 1918. And we sort of know this already, but it makes it easier to see and to connect it into the story, to see how the fighting that came before August 1914 and that continued after November 1918 were in fact part of the same process of the realignment of global structures of power and legitimacy. Revolutionary regimes came to power, and here we particularly must focus on Eastern Europe, Eastern Central Europe, and then fell amid violent convulsions in Eastern Central Europe. The massive carnage of the Russian Civil War continued and in fact intensified after the armistice, unabated. as did a number of large-scale but hitherto little studied relief projects, many of them American, in Russia and Eastern Europe. And here we have the work of Julia Irwin, who's contributed to unearthing some of this material. I still think, even with Julia's book now on the Red Cross, that there is still, really, we really need, I don't think there's any graduate students here, it's too bad, we really need a book, a major book on Hoover's organization in Eastern Europe and Russia. I mean, it's really an amazing story that really hasn't yet been told in the way that it should be, but you know, whoever does it is going to need some skills of Eastern European languages, ideally. So if you're recruiting somebody, keep that in mind. And of course, civil war overtook Anatolia and was accompanied by massacres and population transfers on unprecedented scope at that point in time. Large-scale violence that did not come to an end until 1923, Treaty of Lausanne, which stabilized the situation, at least temporarily. One of the things we see more clearly when we take this expanded frame down to 1923 is that the war also severely damaged and challenged the victorious empires, not only in terms of their domestic situations, but also in terms of their imperial management and organization. We know, of course, that in the spring of 1919, Britain faced major civil unrest in Egypt and in the Punjab, and that by May, British forces, so this is after the war had supposedly ended, were engaged in major military operations in Afghanistan. Ireland went to an extended period of insurgency that led to the establishment of the Irish Free State. The British employ widespread violence in Ireland, in India, Iraq, elsewhere, Afghanistan, of course. The French also do the same, beating back resistance in the Levant and Indochina. The Japanese fight to contain challenges in Korea and in China to their expansion, even as they try to expand well into Siberia in the aftermath of the war and the Russian Revolution. In fact, we see that the entire edifice of the imperial world order was convulsing violently even as it reached its greatest territorial extent. The mass violence of the war had not ended. It only shifted its modes and focal points after the armistice. So perhaps the ironic legacy, one of the ironic legacies of the Great War, is that a war of empires, fought by empires, for the survival and expansion of empire, ended up being the undoing of colonial empires, which were for centuries the preeminent type of state organization that had governed the logic of international relations. The violence that racked the territories of most of the participants, both winners and losers, was, yes, in part a struggle over the remnants of fallen empires. But it also reflected the crisis of imperial legitimacy and governance, indeed, as Michael Addis has taught us, of imperial civilization, ignited by the conflict. After all, a war fought for the rights of small nations could not but shake the foundations of the empires that undertook them. Henceforth, European colonial empires, even while reaching their greatest geographic extent, could only limp along because the ideas at their centers, ideas about civilization, about racial supremacy, about progress, were exposed as false. And with the post-war arrangements at the same time giving new weight to discourses of legitimacy based on arguments of homogeneity and indigeneity, discourses, of course, inherently antithetical to the idea of empires and usually summarized under the very vague term self-determination. Thus, from a vantage point of a century hence, more or less, depending on whether you look at 1914, 11, 23, what have you, the Great War appears less as a discrete cataclysmic event of the traditional narrative, but as part, not least, of a long-term historical arc that marked a shift from one form of global political organization to another, from a world of empires to a world of nation-states. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next presenter is Matt Jacobs, who is Associate Professor at the University of Florida. His book, Imagining the Middle East, The Building of an American Foreign Policy, 1918 to 1967, is probably going to be part of what he's talking about today. So, Matt, take it away.
All right, a couple things to start with here. First, Erez, thanks for that. And much of what I'm going to say is actually going to fit into the framework that you just laid out. And I didn't know you were going to do that, which is fantastic, though, because it actually connects well. Other thing, very quickly, is that I actually do have a written talk, but I went to print it this morning, and the computers in the hotel are old enough that they can't convert a Mac file to PC. So I now have jotted notes on some notebook paper here, which will ensure, I think, that I keep this down to 10 minutes here. So when we think about, I'm here to speak on World War I in the Middle East, and the tentative title is World War I, A War and Peace for the Middle East. And when we think about the Middle East in World War I, we tend to think of it as a sideshow, really. And I think that does a disservice both to the war and to the Middle East. And I don't want to dwell on the horrors of war, but let's talk about them briefly. The Middle Eastern theater was larger than the European theater, extending all the way from what is now Western Turkey through Eastern Anatolia into Central Asia, in the south from Egypt through the Sinai into Palestine, across into what was then Persia, now Iran. So geographically, it's a bigger theater. When you go into the more morbid discussions of deaths and death percentages or deaths as a percentage of population, the Ottoman Empire far surpasses, if you look at the decade from 1914 until 1923-24, far surpasses, in terms of the percentage of the population, deaths of any country in Europe. No one is even close. The lowest estimate suggests that 15 or 16% of the Ottoman population died between 1914 and 1923. The highest estimates put it at 27%. So somewhere between 3.5 to 5.5 million people out of a population of between 20 and 21 million at the time. The nearest European countries are Romania at between 7 and 10%, and Serbia at between 12 and 16%. None of these so-called main European participants, France, Belgium, Germany, England, or Russia, are above 5%. So the social economic upheaval that comes as a consequence of that is enormous, and we can't overlook that. So given that, I would actually make the deliberately provocative assertion that the war's impact is at least as great on the Middle East, and in some ways perhaps greater on the Middle East than it is on Europe. And we need to consider the legacies of the war in that context. And I want to focus particularly on 4 broad transformations that I think will help explain this. And I want to go back to a comment somebody made in the first presentation. I think the person introducing the first presentation. Summer of 1914, anybody who lives in the Middle East or is an interested observer of the Middle East would be very hard-pressed to imagine just how different their world would look just 10 years later. Everything that they would know about the region virtually would be different, okay? You'd have greater outside intervention in the region. The political boundaries would be completely redefined. You would have new organizational structures. You would have a new economy emerging 10 years later based on emerging oil industry. So all of these things fit into the legacies that we must consider when we think about World War I and its role or impact on the Middle East. So I want to start with foreign involvement, and the other 3 themes are the creation of the Middle East state system, the rise of nationalist movements, or perhaps the expansion of some nationalist movements and the emergence of others in the Middle East, and then lastly the oil industry is the 4 big themes. So foreign involvement. Obviously, there's foreign involvement in the Middle East before you get to World War I. I mean, the Ottomans are declining through the 19th century. By 1880s, you actually have Britain and France largely in control of the Ottoman economy. Most of the Ottoman economy is mortgaged to the Europeans. So I don't mean to suggest that what happens after had no precedent. But when you look at what happens during the war and after the war, it's very clear very early in the war, I think, that the Ottoman Empire is not going to survive it. So you have a series of what I'll call very sort of traditional events, Hussein-McMahon correspondence, Sykes-Picot, which I would argue are actually efforts to imagine a post-Ottoman future. There's, in some cases, expedient, in some cases, poorly imagined exercises, but they are exercises in imagining a post-Ottoman future. So Hussein-McMahon, again, expedient to get Arabs into the war, but it is an initial effort to think about what would the world, this region, look like after the Ottoman Empire falls. Sykes-Picot, a reversion to what I would call traditional imperial policies and behavior, an effort to assert European control over what a post-Ottoman Empire world might look like. Russian discussions about trying to take over Constantinople and the Bosporus and to forcefully relocate Muslims from that area to move in Cossacks to control it. These were actively discussed among the Russians in the middle of the war period. And then, of course, the League of Nations mandate system, formalized through talks at San Remo, and ultimately all of this finalized through Lausanne in 1923. This formalized Anglo-French control of much of the former Ottoman Empire. And so it was a reassertion in some ways of old-style imperial behaviors. And so I think that conforms nicely to Erez's concept of as a war about empire in many respects. I would also add here that the U.S., there's an aspect about the United States in this that I will come back to in a few minutes. And the last point on the foreign involvement is, of course, also the violence that attends that, particularly with the French in what comes to be Syria in 1921-22, the first sustained bombing campaign from the air of civilian populations takes place there by the French as they try to assert authority over particularly Damascus, but also other parts of Syria. So that's the first theme is the notion of foreign involvement. Second, the Middle Eastern state system. Here I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I'm going to assume that most of us here in this audience will recognize that the states that emerge as a product of the mandate system, the boundaries that are defined there, so on and so forth. So I don't think I need to go into that extensively, but I will say that the negotiations through which that takes place, something like San Remo in 1920, where you have very explicit negotiations. Mosul was supposed to be initially part of the French mandate and would be part of Syria today. The British want control of that and agree to pay 20% of any oil profits to the French in exchange for getting Mosul. So something as basic as that, those negotiations clearly define those boundaries. And by clearly I mean here as a process, not necessarily in terms of what other people might want later on. So I think it's important for us to think through those issues. And then obviously in the Turkish case, as the successor state to the Ottoman Empire, the process of war with Greece, civil war ultimately coming to an end, again formalized through the Lausanne discussions in 1923, and the discussion to move the capital from Constantinople to Ankara as a way, and I'll come back to this in a second with nationalism, as a way to try to promote a new sense of Turkish nationalism as well, I think is important for us to think about when we look at the legacies as they refer to, or as they're relevant to the Middle Eastern state system. The third thing would be the rise of nationalisms. And again, nationalist movements had existed in the region beforehand. I don't mean to suggest that they didn't. There had been an emerging Arab nationalist sentiment directed at the Ottoman Empire, also against increasing European control and against emerging Jewish presence in Palestine. But in part due to the war, the Balfour Declaration, you do have Zionism taking even deeper root in the region And that's the combination or connection between a religious identity and a sense of nationalism. And of course, in response to that, you have a parallel version that emerges among Palestinians and among Muslims and Arabs more broadly across the region. Evidenced later on, in part by a group like the Muslim Brotherhood, which was also an anti-colonial group. Again, I want to come back to Turkey. Turkey represents another kind of nationalism that we see emerge as a consequence of World War I. And as Turkey begins to try to move beyond its past and asserts a new sort of identity, you have the nationalisms that are constructed by the new state to try to define what the future will look like. And I would argue with this, that the Turkish case and some of these others represented an enduring tension that comes out of the war between what I might call a more kind of organic regional nationalism, Arab nationalism more broadly defined, versus or against those more state-specific nationalisms that must be constructed as countries move out of the mandate system into independence later on. The fourth theme, I've got about 2 minutes left here, the oil industry integrated the Middle East more fully into international politics, international economy, and I would also argue international conflict. As Europeans and Americans begin to define the Middle East as a region of geopolitical significance, and not only because of oil, but certainly in large part because of oil, this does bring outsiders in and bring the Middle East into the rest of the world in certain ways that it had not been before. It has a dramatic implication for the United States, too, obviously, in terms of the development of the U.S. oil industry and the international oil industry, bringing the U.S. more formally into the Middle East in both business and government terms. And it also has a domestic component to it, because the United States government demonstrated here that it was, A, willing to really put its power behind the open door notes. So this is the first time that the open door notes really get tested in the international arena. And it's willing to do so even when doing so runs against domestic antitrust laws and policies that had been implemented just a decade earlier. And so I think that there's an interesting story for us to think about there. The last couple things I'd like us to consider here, I'm not going to go through these, but maybe we can in discussion. What would some counterfactuals be here? If you take 4 different decisions that were made, or 4 issues, and think about what if they had been done in the opposite way. And these are 4 things that it's not a stretch for us to try to consider. What if the United States had entered the war earlier, or actually declared war on the Ottoman Empire, which it never did. In fact, if you read Wilson's declaration of war, it explicitly excludes anybody except Germany from it. So how does that alter things if that decision is taken differently? And again, it's not a stretch to ask that question. Second one would be, what if Wilson had opposed the Balfour Declaration? He considered it for 3 months. So what if he actually opposes that rather than supporting it? How does that alter the situation? The third, and here I think is the biggest one, what if the United States joins the League of Nations? One thing that we know would have happened is that the United States would have had a mandate in Armenia. There's no doubt about that. Even though the United States never joined, they still the League tried to get the U.S. to assume a mandate in Armenia. So that would have happened, and it's possible that the United States would have had mandates in other parts of the region as well. And then lastly, in terms of the counterfactuals, what if Woodrow Wilson had been the Woodrow Wilson that we have imagined him to be in different ways? Which is to say, what if he thought that self-determination was a principle that did apply outside of Europe? What if Woodrow Wilson wasn't the Southern racist that we thought, that we know that he was? How might that, and what if he was less constrained by the politics of the time? How might that have altered the legacies of World War I, the ways that we think about World War I in the Middle East? So just to conclude here, how do we characterize World War I and its legacies overall? I would argue that it is a war and a peace for the modern Middle East. and I'll fill that out here in a second. But I think we also need to understand it as a contest or a clash between the old and the new. It is in some ways a last gasp of European and American powers to assert their imperial authority, to try to negotiate or work out for the Middle East a distribution of power, of territory, and of resources, much like what they had done regarding Africa in the 1880s and what they tried to do in parts of Asia at the turn of the century. So I think that if we think of it in those terms as this kind of effort to reassert older style imperial authorities, that then bumps up against new forces of nationalism within the region, either indigenous or imported, new economic relations, a new industrializing, oil-driven international economy, and so on. I think that in even a hesitant, if still very powerful U.S., when we think about all those things, we need to ask ourselves, what was this war really about in the Middle East? And again, I would argue that it's a war not to end all wars, but a war that leads to a peace that may, to borrow David Franken's title of his book, end all peace in the Middle East, at least for the century that followed. So I'll end there. I went over by a couple minutes, but stayed relatively close to time. So.
Thank you. Our final panelist is Klaus Schwabe, who taught at the Technical University in Aachen, Germany, and is probably most famous among scholars of World War I in the United States for his book, Woodrow Wilson, Revolutionary Germany and Peacemaking, 1918 to 1919, Missionary Diplomacy and the Realities of Power.
Thank you for your kind introduction. Thanks to the organizers for giving me the chance to venture upon another expedition in history in this country. And I will return to the heart of Europe, Germany, and the legacy of World War I. It's a topic that is boundless, of course, because it covers the story how German development derailed for decades. A story, I'm afraid, that can't be told in 10 minutes. So I had to find a focus, and in a way the focus was self-evident. The major legacy, one way or another, you'll find out, of World War I to Germany, of course, was Adolf Hitler. So this is the subject I'm going to concentrate on him. And once more, I propose to raise the question as to whether Hitler's rise to power can be seen, or certainly is a consequence of World War I, but the question is whether this rise to power was more or less inevitable or not. So I will focus on the 20s, on the Weimar Republic, no word about Wilson, and only to an extent I'll touch foreign relations. In order to help to answer my question, I singled out three popular doctrines, three fixed opinions, you may even say three conspiracy theories, simplicities, I learned that term this morning, which provide a mental bridge, a transition from World War I to Hitler. And these doctrines I want to very briefly to describe are, first, the doctrine of the stab in the back that was made responsible for Germany's defeat. Secondly, the anti-Semitic doctrine, which after the war viewed the Jews as the source of Germany's miseries. And thirdly, the so-called war guilt lie, that is the doctrine that Germany from 1914 to 18 had been attacked, fought a defensive war, and that the victor's accusation that Germany's aggression had started the war was wrong, was a lie. Therefore, war guilt lie, as we say, Kriegsschuldlüge. All three doctrines had their roots in Germany's domestic history, during World War I. No time to go into that, maybe during the discussion. So they were legacies of the war. Still, all the three doctrines did not gain their full political potential until the end of the war. At that point, all three of these doctrines reflected a denial of Germany's military defeat, a denial of reality, if you wish. Let me quickly turn to these doctrines individually. The stab in the back. This doctrine meant that the German army had not been defeated by military means, but due to defeatism, you say, right? Defeatism at home. This defeatism was supposed to have undermined the fighting spirit of the German troops until it finally led to the revolution of November 1918 and Germany's demand in early October of 1918 for an armistice negotiations and the peace on the basis of Woodrow Wilson's peace program. Then the armistice itself actually surrender, and ultimately the acceptance by Germany of the onerous terms of the Versailles Peace. All these decisions were condemned as a consequence of shirking, of outright treason. They were condemned as a stab in the back of the valiant German military forces. There's an American variety to the stab in the back doctrine, but again, no time to go into this. This doctrine was widely accepted. Hindenburg, the towering national symbol, publicly endorsed it, so did a couple of courts and judges. All along, the stab in the back doctrine remained a political weapon in the hands of the German right, wielded to discredit all those personalities, whether social democrats or left-wing liberals, who had resumed responsibility during the German Revolution and therefore more or less identified with the result of that revolution, that is, the German democracy. Secondly, anti-Semitism. It was virtually exploding. It is striking to see that after the armistice, it offered a racial explanation to the source of the treason which had led to the revolution and to Germany's downfall. The Jews were seen as profiteers both of the war and the revolution. The assassination in 1922 of Walter Rathenau, the most prominent German political personality of Jewish descent, marked the peak of this slanderous campaign. And finally, three, the so-called World War guilt lie. It referred to the Versailles Peace Treaty, Article 231, which you know, and which stated that, I quote, "The Allied and associated governments affirm and Germany accepts the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all losses as a consequence of the war imposed by the aggression of Germany." When the German government challenged that assertion, the victors reacted even more violently. They condemned Germany's conduct, and I quote, "conduct in the war as almost unexampled in human history," end of quote. Germany thus appeared as a criminal. The assertion seemed to violate, first of all, Germany's honor as a nation. It seemed even to question Germany's identity as a nation. And more than that, of course, the victors seemed to base their reparation claims on Germany's alleged war guilt. No German patriot could accept that lie. This protest, of course, covered not only the right, but also practically the whole spectrum of German public opinion. This campaign compromised and had an impact on the conduct of Germany's diplomacy, foreign relations. In the Reichstag, the parliament, the right-wing parties refused to ratify any accommodation with France and Great Britain, a policy that Foreign Minister Gustav Stresemann stood for. The right, on the contrary, demanded as a prerequisite for supporting Stresemann that the Allies first restore Germany's honor, and renounce the war guilt clause of the Versailles Treaty. And in 1929, the combined right mounted a vitriolic campaign demanding a referendum that, if accepted, would have obliged the German government not to sign the Young Plan for a final settlement of the reparation issue. Hitler joined that campaign. To him, it was a bonanza for his propaganda. And this brings me finally to Hitler. Hitler's political creed combined, generalized, and vastly radicalized the three just mentioned nationalist doctrines. To him, the perpetrators of the stab in the back were whether Jews or members of the left. They were all Novemberverbrecher, criminals of November, the month of the German Revolution. He was the most, everyone knows it, the most strident anti-Semite among the German right by making the Jews the scapegoats, whether as of Germany's fate, development, whether as organizers of the German Revolution, or as greedy capitalists, or also as Bolshevik terrorists. They were everything. Now, from Hitler's early writings on, he demanded both the extinction of the Jewish pestilence, as he called it, and as a precondition, the setting up of a totalitarian Führerstaat dictatorship. Hitler's condemnation of the victor's war guilt lie was, so-called war guilt lie, was the keynote of his campaign against the Young Plan. For the referendum, he insisted on a provision to be inserted which made the admission by a German public personality that Germany might just share some responsibility for the war's outbreak, made such statements as punishable as treason. It's a foretaste for things that were to come. But what effect, that's the final and definite question, what effect did Hitler's propaganda have? At this point, the time factor is all important. During the mid-20s, the prosperous, relatively prosperous years of the Weimar Republic, Hitler's extremist views made him part of the lunatic fringe on the right in Germany of those days. Hitler did gain some national notoriety outside Bavaria by joining the drive, just mentioned drive against the Young Plan. But this referendum utterly failed. Only 14% of the German electorate, instead of the necessary 50, supported the referendum. A year before, in 1928, at the national election, Hitler's party won a mere 2.8% of the German vote. Under present condition, his party would not have been represented in the parliament. But then, 2 years afterwards, in the national election of September 1930, Hitler won a landslide of 18.3% of the electorate. So the question comes up, what had happened to explain this breakdown? Now, you know the answer, I guess. I shared the view that Hitler's election victory of 1930 was mainly due to two factors that were not immediately related to World War I. The first factor, of course, was the Great Depression, a disaster, as you know, of American vintage, and the repercussions of the Depression in Germany, repercussions which played into Hitler's hands and gave his anti-Semitism a further anti-capitalist flavor. It can be shown that the first local electoral gains Hitler made during 1929-1930, earlier than the national election, that they were closely related to the rise of unemployment in those areas. The other factor that contributed to Hitler's breakthrough, the other factor goes further back into German political culture, German history. As Stresemann before mentioned, repeatedly pointed out monarchical Germany had lacked a tradition of the kind of responsible parliamentary government that actually the Weimar Constitution provided for. The resulting political behavior survived the revolution, survived into the Weimar Republic. The German voter did not honor governmental responsibility, but rather punished it by voting against governmental parties. Politicians, even social democrats, therefore felt more comfortable on the side of the parliamentary opposition, not in the government. The ultimate resignation of the last parliamentary government Republican Germany had, it was a great coalition, can be traced back to that culture of political abstinence. In 1930, that great coalition broke apart because its decisive members failed to assume responsibility for compromises regarding issues that seem trivial today, a little bit like Obamacare. That rupture paved for governments that derived their legitimacy no longer from Parliament, but from the President, from Hindenburg. To sum up, it is true, as John Kershaw has stated, that only the First World War made Hitler possible. But it's equally true that Hitler's political successes that led to his dictatorship were not an immediate product of World War I. Hitler provided the arsenal of instruments to destroy the German Republic and sharpened them, and these instruments, to be sure, dated back to the war. But what counted was their implementation, their successful application to political reality. And these factors depended on determinants that were no longer directly related to the war. The course of German history from World War I to Hitler's dictatorship was not a one-way street. It was not predetermined. World War I was a necessary but not a sufficient cause of the collapse of the Weimar Republic and of Hitler's coming to power. Thank you.
All right, so many thanks to all of our panelists. We have approximately a half an hour for questions, and I've been encouraged to encourage you to ask questions or to kind of keep your comments brief. And we have certainly, we'll be going to lunch after this, so we can continue a discussion there. So, and if you could introduce yourself, Andy.
Andy Buchanan from the University of Vermont. I just wanted to first of all, just thank Alice for this wonderful reframing of the whole question. I mean, it seems to me this is kind of what we need to be doing this entire day, is getting deeper into the sort of perspective that you opened up here. I know many of us who teach World War II are used to challenging students on, hey, what are the dates of World War II? Maybe it starts in 1931 with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, and using that to sort of decenter some of the traditional narratives. So I think doing this in this bigger way in relation to World War I is really great. I just have this is a question. You ended up saying, and maybe this was the time to not be able to fully develop it, arc for the transition from a world of empires to a world of nation states. Surely, that's the question, surely is it not better to see it as a transitional point from a world of colonial empire to a world of global hegemony that was not going to be based on direct colonial rule, but was going to be justified, to use the name that cannot be spoken, by ideologies of national self-determination, free trade, the open door, etc., etc. If you see it in that light, of course it's also an unfinished process. It's not really going to be finished, but even then maybe not finished. Bretton Woods, the founding of the United Nations, I mean, you're going to push it back another 20 years or so to see that project sort of really come. But that transitional character, it seems to me, is very, very, there's a lot of fruitful investigation into that. My final point on that, wow, a US mandate in Armenia. Talk about a good reason from that point of view for not being in for being in the League of Nations. Because the mandate is a colony, essentially, right? An American colony in Armenia goes a little bit against the master narrative that I'm just kind of outlining here.
Respond. Hegemony question?
Sure, hegemony. Yes, I think maybe if I had gone on for another paragraph to define these two orders, I might have gone in this direction. It wasn't intended as a statement that suggests progress. It was intended as a statement that suggests transformation. It is a world based on arguments from legitimacy that talk about nation states. It is also at the same time a world that is intended to, and this kind of in a sense brings us back to Wilson, is intended to bring about a U.S.-centered hegemonic order. And in a sense, it's too far to say that this is what these nation states are intended to serve in a sense, but this is, and certainly we have to give people like Wilson the credit that they thought this was going to be good for everybody. It's a win-win kind of thing. But it sets up the basic structure of international society where this hegemony could play out. And this is a hegemony that is based, at least partially in that imagining, on what we now tend to call American soft power. That is the American example, in a sense, of how one constructs political entities, which is why I'm somewhat critical of those who interpret at least Wilson's view of self-determination as very strictly based on national or racial lines. Actually, I've never found any instance where Wilson says national self-determination in any of his speeches or any of his references. It's always a much looser conception of self-determination that is rooted in liberal traditions rather than in specifically nationalist claims. With regard to Armenia, I'll let, I'm sure Matt has something to say, but I actually think, the United States had colonies. This wouldn't have been such a break at that point in time, and in fact, having a colony under an international mandate that is supposedly at least managed by the League of Nations would have been, in a sense, a progressive move relative to the colony in the Philippines or in other places. So it would have been, and from the Armenian perspective, it might actually have been a better result than what happened. Whether or not that's even, I have a hard time imagining the domestic American political system accepting this kind of arrangement. But if we let our imaginations roam free for a moment, it probably would have been preferable to what ended up happening.
The only thing I would say in terms of those hypotheticals, I'm not presuming in asking that things would have necessarily been better. Okay, all I'm asking is those were 3 or 4 decisions that actually could, if you take the opposite course, which isn't a stretch of the imagination to ask what happens if the United States joins the League of Nations or if Wilson doesn't support Balfour or whatever. How different does that make things? And the concept of the Armenian mandate, I would say I tend to agree with you in the sense that I don't think the American population would have really gone for that concept. And I think the hypothetical falls down in certain ways because there's a reason why we don't join the League of Nations too, which isn't just based on, I think the American population, if it had gotten that far, would have had some other things to say about it. Let me put it that way. But I still think it's an interesting hypothetical to consider. And the other one that was discussed really, really widely was Palestine as a mandate. And how does that alter things if there's an American mandate in Palestine?
This was actually maybe even closer because the King Crane Commission has suggested that this is what should happen. Yeah.
Yes, they do. I mean, they make and they suggest Armenia too. So,
thank you. Yep.
I'm thrilled by your starting your big volume in 1911 with the Italian intervention in Libya because I think that was a very important step. And I was amazed reading the statement of the Italian Prime Minister Giolitti who actually felt that his hands were forced in this, and he said, the maintenance of the Ottoman Empire is the root of European peace, and if we start intervening there, there may be soon a war in the Balkans, and that may lead to a world war. He said this in 1911. He was so far-sighted about it, and nevertheless he intervened in Libya. And I would wonder whether you could throw a bit more light on the Italian decision with a prime minister who saw the evolution of the further events so clearly that he warned of it. He must have thought, of course, that there is a window of opportunity and it closes soon, so we must rush in. But it's a very interesting paradox that this prime minister intervened who had this clear vision.
Yeah, I wish I could throw more light on that. It's too bad I don't have our contributor here that wrote about the Italian Empire. I don't think he focused as much on the decision but rather on the legacies and implications of that, which is exactly what you said, which it destabilizes the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans, and it sets up the Ottoman Empire as a target for further encroachments. And really is a straight line, as you suggested, from that to the summer of 1914. So I'm sorry, there's not a great deal more I could say. I love that quote. I don't think I've come across it. I wonder if our author knew about it, because it would have been a great, I don't think it's in the chapter, it would have been a great epigraph for the chapter, maybe even for the entire book. Well, I'm going to call up Oxford University Press, and see if they can still make changes. I'm not sure, but that's a great, do you have a reference for that? I mean, that's a wonderful quote. Yeah, okay, great.
When it goes to paper.
Yep.
Paperback, right?
Yep.
Just a question for Erez and one for Matt as well. Erez, I love the reframing of the First World War as the Greater War and a war for empire and that sort of thing. You didn't really talk about it, but the person who I think of immediately when I think of the argument that the war was a war for empire is Lenin, and imperialism is the highest form of capitalism. So obviously that's not what you were arguing, but where does this Leninist Marxist critique of empire as the cause of war, as the cause of World War I, as a clash of empires over resources, over land, over imperial competition, that sort of thing, which hasn't had a lot of love from the historiography, certainly in the last 20 years, but did for a long time after he wrote that in 1917. So I was wondering where that fits in. 1916, thanks, Anders. The question for Matt is, and here I'm going to bring you in as well, is, so the U.S. doesn't declare war on the Ottoman Empire. It obviously didn't. A lot of that has to do with missionaries begging the Wilson administration, begging Wilson not to, because they would be put, obviously, at risk because they had a huge presence. But what does that do to our understanding, or at least of the way Anders presented it, and I think it was a very compelling way of presenting it, of the war in a lot of Americans' eyes as one of civilization and as one of freedom or democracy against autocracy, because you can make a case, and people did in 1914, 15, 16, 17, with gradually increasing intensity of the war as one against German autocracy. But the easy case to make, if it's a war of civilization, is the Ottoman Empire, right? I mean, that is, and it has been for decades and decades, because of the treatment of the Armenians in 1915 and in 1895, because of Ottoman despotism, because of all the things that Said would call Orientalism, this view of the Ottoman Empire. I mean, if it is a war of civilization, then the Ottoman Empire is your poster boy for doing that, and yet they don't, right? As you said quite rightly. So I was wondering how you would reconcile what you're saying with what Anders was saying earlier.
Lenin? Yeah. So, I mean, look, you probably expect me to sort of jump ship, not to be group of one, but I actually have no problem with that. I mean, to a certain extent, what he was saying was simply a very trivial observation. I mean, and I don't think it was that observation in and of itself, that this was a war about empire, was or is particularly controversial. I think where the things diverge is, well, two ways. First of all, I think for Lenin, as you suggested yourself, imperialism was in a sense epiphenomenal. The issue was capitalism, and imperialism was simply a stage of capitalism, and his analysis.
The highest stage.
Yes, the highest stage. So this suggests that that after this stage, capitalism is essentially self-destructs and disappears. And of course, he was profoundly wrong about that. Capitalism turned out to be far more malleable, far more adaptable, and far less dependent on these types of formal colonial empires than he thought it was. And this goes back to the first question. But in a sense, the nationalist framing was, even at the time, a central part of the propaganda of the major Western powers, partly because the British in particular, also the French, had to take the unprecedented step, the Americans too, of introducing conscription. And in their home, in the home territories. And once you introduce conscription, you kind of have to, they had to have this kind of nationalist framing around it, which I think then infected much of the historiography. And in a sense, we're trying to strip that out of the story. All the more power to Lenin. But I think he was more wrong than right. It turns out with that analysis.
To follow up, the first thing I'll do is acknowledge right up front that I'm not a Wilson nor a World War I scholar. I started off a project dealing with the post-45 period and found that I needed to go back to World War I to try to understand some of the stuff I was dealing with. So I'll say that I haven't read all of Wilson's writings, and quite frankly, I don't have interest in reading all of Wilson's writings either. So in that sense, I will just confess ignorance to some degree. But I will say this. Your point about the missionaries is vital here. And I don't believe that Wilson had a clearly thought out Middle East policy, as it were, in any respect. But if you look at who some influential people were around him in particular, who funded his 1912 and 1916 presidential campaigns? Money from Phelps Dodge Mining Company. The Dodge family set up what becomes American University in Beirut. There's a whole set of twins and stuff where one twin goes to the Middle East and one twin goes into mining and oil resources. And and then they'll have grandkids who are twins, and one becomes president of AUB and one becomes president of oil companies in the Middle East. And then ultimately in the 1980s, one person who retires from running an oil company in the Middle East becomes president of American University of Beirut. And the Dodge family funded his 1912 presidential campaign and his re-election campaign. The second aspect is who's also one of his closest advisors or friends, Brandeis, who is in the middle of transitioning into supporting the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. So if you look at folks who are around him, even though, again, I don't want to sort of suggest conspiracy theories here either. I'm kind of thinking through this on the spot here. But I would suggest that he has very influential advisors, people who are close to him, who do think about, maybe we don't want to, be going in there at this point for not even the same reasons, but they have the reasons and they speak to him about these sorts of things. But the connection with Andrew's point is, of course, if you look at the rhetoric over time about the Ottoman Empire, going back to the 1860s when two ministers get murdered by just highway thieves, basically, and the U.S. The head of the legations there say, we've got to make sure that we send a message to the rest of the Ottomans that this isn't how you do this. They need to be put to death, and we need to make sure it's done in front of everybody because they'll appreciate that, and so on and so on. That kind of rhetoric about the lack of civilization, runs throughout decades of this. So I agree with you that would be the obvious place to go, but he doesn't.
You're forgetting about Charles Crane, who makes his money off toilet bowls.
Yeah.
You almost imagine thinking, if we can civilize the Middle East, they'll have a lot more toilet bowls.
Well, no, certainly, yeah. Anytime you're in any place where you see a Crane toilet, that is Crane of King Crane, actually. So.
Julia? Yeah, there was this question for you. I really appreciate your call to see this as a wider spatial war. You've taken us everywhere from Europe, Western to Eastern Europe, to the Middle East, to Asia, to Africa. But of course, if we were thinking of this as a world war, a global war, where we still have Central and South America left out of our story. I was wondering if this maybe to you had any reflections on how we fit them into the narrative, especially the Latin American republics. Do they fit in, or does the sort of relative lack of involvement of Latin American republics tell us something different about this period, that it's not all about the global war, that there are other big stories to be told?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I have to reiterate that this is sort of work that Robert and I have done together, so I don't want to take more than half the credit, maybe a bit less. I was troubled by that too, by our inability, in a sense, to bring Latin America into the story. I don't know, I think that inability is a combination of the shortcomings of our project and perhaps also of literature that's out there and the people that's out there that were able to contribute to the volume. And at the same time, it also might say something about the place of Latin America in world affairs in this period of time. What the percentages, how one would divide the percentages between these two causes, I'm not sure. Whether it's more sort of the state historiography / our limitations, or whether it's more a historical artifact rather than a historiographical artifact. I mean, it is the case that several Latin American countries declare war. It is the case that several Latin American countries have seats at the Paris Peace Conference. It is also the case that as far as I have read into that literature, I cannot, other than seeing them mentioned as having seats, I cannot remember anybody ever writing anything having to do with what they did there, or what influence, if any, they had, or what issues they came, why they even saw themselves as, what they had in mind coming there. I'm sure they had in mind something. There was some kind of program. It wasn't just a vacation in Paris. But I just am not aware of any historiography, and it may be that someone in this room is aware and can put this in the. I see Chris. In the paperback version, maybe there'll be a revised paperback version. We'll include chapters. Yeah. Chris, do you want to punch in on that?
I would say maybe one thing, and then sort of try to get Ben's here sort of drag him in as well, which is that I think it's partly a story about these nations sort of competing for global attention, right? I think the story of Central and particularly of Latin America is also a story of the withdrawal of Britain and Germany from economic influence. So, the volume as you framed it was largely about territorial empires, which makes Latin America, where the imperial or neo-colonial, whatever term you want to put on them, of Britain and Germany sort of seems less visible in that sense. But I think it's also a story of contests over who gets to control Pan-Americanism. Right? And here, actually, there is a literature that goes all the way back to Emily Rosenberg's dissertation, that sort of sees the U.S. and Mexico sort of competing for authority to speak as Pan-American, as the voice of Pan-Americanism. So that's what I would put on the table. But I think it speaks to the larger absence of the Mexican Revolution from the history of the First World War.
And do we know how the war sort of inflects that struggle that you were just talking about speaking for Pan-Americanism? Is there a way in which it does, or is it not clear yet?
I'm not sure I can speak to that. I think the Mexican Revolution disrupts the debate over Pan-Americanism more than the war.
That's right. I was going to ask Matt about Aramco. Would World War I have made any, if it hadn't occurred, would Aramco still arise?
That's a great question. In the specifics of do you have an Arabian American oil company in the sense, I think ultimately you probably do, actually. Does it? Because quite frankly, if you look at something like the Red Line Agreement done in 1927, ultimately, Aramco emerges outside of that. As soon as the Red Line Agreement, which is supposed to formalize access to all the oil in Saudi Arabia and all this other stuff, as soon as that's in place, the ink is barely dry on it. You've got efforts to negotiate agreements outside of that that immediately undercut it. And so I would argue that the Red Line Agreement is part of the legacies of World War I, but the fact that it's immediately subverted suggests that something like Aramco would have come into existence.
The technological push and the economic push.
Yeah, because you've already got Anglo-Persian in before World War I as it is, and so there's already a sense that hey, there's a whole lot of oil in this part of the world, and we want to try to find access to it. That's why Britain is willing to deploy troops into Persia at the time to defend that, and so on. So I think in some ways, I think it's likely that story continues. Would it have been different in certain ways? Sure, but I think the basic story continues there.
Anders?
Yeah, but
Do you want to go first?
two questions, very briefly. The empire angle is, of course, attractive because it opens up the scope and it allows you to talk about lots of different things that you otherwise wouldn't be able to do. So, fine on that score. But even though the World War is a discrete kind of sequence, it does not gain, I don't think, just to move it back to 1911. I think one would want to preserve the importance of August, as Chris Clark does. However, the question is this: imperial forms, what is it in the clash of empires as opposed to the clash of nations that explains more than the other thing? In other words, is there anything explanatory in the concept of empire in this context? I.e., is the same sort of issue at stake for Austria-Hungary as an empire, Russia as an empire, as it is in the case of Italy, or for that matter, France or the US? So I'm just curious whether the imperial, as opposed to actually Lenin's imperialism, which is a different kettle of fish actually, if that is really an explanatory device or just a narrative way for you to kind of say interesting things about a lot of interesting things. I have a question, very brief one for Klaus as well. Isn't Stalin's, internal decision to kill off the Bukharian wing of the Bolshevik Party in 28 and the beginning of the third period, and therefore the shocking against the Social Democrats in Germany, a precondition for 1930 as well? I.e., if he had decided to kill off the left instead at that point.
What was it?
If he had decided to go for technical, I was about to say opportunistic reasons, he goes for the right at that point, and he goes for the internal right. Zinoviev, having been eliminated along with Trotsky at that stage, because he wants to get, and he does that by the extreme leftist turn of 1928, which means that the KPD, with I don't know how many million members in Germany, actually decides to go for the tactical enemy, the SPD, in point of fact, instead of the Nazis. And so that would be a precondition as well. It's not a contrary argument to your own position. I was just curious what you thought about that.
Go ahead, Klaus.
Yeah. Of course, you're right. That's an aspect I just didn't have time to go into. But as far as I can see, the Communist Party, on the behest of Moscow, Stalin, entered a more radical tactics in 28-29, which had something to do with the internal divisions of the Bolshevik Party. And this, of course, was an additional argument on the right, now that the Bolshevik, the specter of the Bolshevik revolution demanded a return to a stronger position on the part of Germany. This was really a third factor beyond the anti-Semitism and all that, which, of course, in a way played into Hitler's hand because he was the most decisive anti-Bolshevik among the lot on the right.
And so, Erez, what can you get out of empire that you can't get out of nations?
Yeah, so I think, to some extent, it's the first thing that you said. It does invite empire, thinking about it as empire, does invite both a broader temporal and a broader geographic scope. Analytically, I think it does at least two things. One is it sharpens, I think, our sense as to what was at stake in the war for the parties. For example, what happens in the Middle East with the British and French, oftentimes one can still, even to this day, find the literature presented as the British and the French kind of falling ass backwards into empire in the Middle East. They go into this European war, then they suddenly find themselves, with these territories in the Levant and in all these other places. And I think if you start out thinking that this is a war of empire and for empire, you will reject that kind of interpretation. You will think of these imperial gains as one of the central stakes that are being fought over rather than simply sort of incidental results of the war. So that's one thing. The other thing I think that it does is it helps us historicize the emergence of the nation state within the context of the events of the war. That is to say, rather than assuming the nation state as a pre-existing thing that goes to war, thinking about it as empire sees how the war in itself creates or helps create, not out of complete whole cloth, but helps in the process of creating nation states, not just in the obvious places where we typically talk about, which is in East Central Europe, the shards of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, or in the Middle East, as Matt was talking about the Arab state system, but also in Britain and in France and in Australia and in Canada and in New Zealand and so on and so forth. So I think, and again, this is not that and nobody's ever thought about these things before, but I don't think many people have thought about them in this global context. And so those are two things, I think, analytically, that this imperial frame can do in terms of how we think about the war. And I will say, I don't mean to say that summer of 1914 is unimportant, but I do think that starting in 1911 really helps emphasize and sensitize us to the imperial context in which 1914 happens.
So both Klaus and Matt want to add something. And
Yeah,
we still have
just
time,
one
so.
word. Of course, this imperial frame applies to Germany as well. The official policy was to return Germany to the status of a world power. And the more traditional forces, they wanted to regain the colonies we had in Africa, whereas Hitler, of course, his project was expansion towards the east. That was new. Yeah. But it was empire still. And of course the term empire was retained. I was talking about Reichspräsident, imperial president in the Weimar Republic.
We have in the book a chapter on the German Empire by Heather Jones.
And all I was going to say was that another thing that, particularly in the British context, and I'll use that because my wife is a historian of the British Empire, she'd be upset with me if I didn't bring it up, is that how do you explain the involvement of the Commonwealth nations without the imperial framework? And not just in the sense of Canadians, sending because they feel obligated, but their investment of people willing to go from New Zealand without an imperial framework as part of that. What's that?
As the Maori soldiers did for France.
Maybe in some ways, maybe not, but yeah.
So I think we have time for two more questions. So Professor Smith, and then I see one over here. So yeah. Okay.
A quick comment. What's exciting about this, it seems to me, is you're opening the possibility for lots of graduate students to do theses on this that legitimizes an interest in areas that otherwise were seen as peripheral. And suddenly you see that they have a lot more importance than used to be the case, or used to be recognized as being the case. Let me add something on Latin America. You're right that there isn't that much on Latin America, but there could be. The reason for this is that when we go back to what the United States was doing, or Wilson at this point, he was in effect modernizing the Monroe Doctrine. The Roosevelt corollary wasn't enough. He wanted to go forward and try and stabilize this area. So that, for example, as early as his first month in office, he issued this incredible non-recognition doctrine about the Mexican Revolution, which is usually not recognized for being as extraordinary as it was. And the whole point was to try and bring about some kind of constitutional order in Mexico. He went from there to the Pan-American treaties. The literature on the Pan-American treaties is terrible. it's usually, I don't know how it's described, but the first order of business always was that the countries pledged themselves to have Republican government. Republican government meant self-government, it meant the consent of the government, the consent of the governed. It was his idea to stabilize through multilateral organizations a new form of order for Latin America. And I don't think anybody has developed this at all sufficiently. He also meant it finally as a template for what would be carried into Europe with the peace settlement. And that's very clear. So the whole Latin American thing, which has been largely ignored, is a very fruitful field for seeing the bigger picture.
Just a quick point, just a quick comment to Matt and Eric. We're all hungry, so I guess. but in terms of, I obviously applaud this wonderful opening up of the war. It's long overdue, but it seemed to me that the whole business of the Armenian genocide, the way you were interpreting it, you could push it even further by arguing, by recognizing the fact that the Turks were fighting, that the Turks were fighting for their lives. They found a leader, they were powerful, and that obviously had an effect on Wilson's, the leverage he had or the ability he had to intervene in the area. And the interesting thing to me about that is that it's not just Clemenceau and Lloyd George and the others, the Europeans who are concerned with Wilson. It's also the realities. It's another way to see the colonial world, the things that are going on there that he simply can't control. One of the King Crane, one of the brilliant suggestions, one of the best things Americans ever said about foreign policy is we should give the Kurds a state. But in the context of what was going on in Syria and Iraq and places like that, and Russia and others, Iran, it wasn't going to happen. So I think that there's so many ways we can push this out, but we always have to be sensitive to who's pushing back from it, because it has a huge impact on us.
The only thing I would say there, and this was something I actually I had in the talk but didn't mention, was that in making the case that World War I had as great an impact on the Middle East, one of the figures that I didn't cite was also civilian deaths. And roughly, again, numbers are fuzzy, but between 30 and 40% of all civilian deaths in World War I occurred in the Ottoman Empire. And at least the numbers I've been able to come up with. So, which is huge when you think about that. Now, people who argue against that say, well, you've got the Armenian massacre, that accounts for 1.5 million of them, and that's kind of outside of it. But it's not. Why does that happen in 1915, 1916? Because concerns over loyalty, disloyalty, you've got units being told they can only serve in rear areas where they're unarmed, efforts to relocate them away from the front because they're concerned that they will fight against the Ottoman forces as well. So it's very much a part of what's going on in World War I. Of course, there's a history, too, that goes back to 1895 as part of this as well that we have to consider.
Very quick. If you look at the archives of the peace conference, you get, there was an Armenian delegation that sends in various claims. There's a Kurdish delegation that sends in various claims. There's also an Asturian, the Iraqi Christian delegation that sends in various claims. They all have maps as to that map out their future states. And if you put those maps on top of each other, they're basically on the same territory. That's part of the story here. And at the end of the day, you're right. It's Ataturk who decides what that map is going to look like in a sense.
All right, so I imagine that we will have some logistical comments about lunch, but before we get to those, please join me in thanking our panelists.